What's up everyone? My name is Mike and I'm a wedding filmmaker based in New York City, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about why I made the switch over from the Panasonic S1 to the Sony A7IV. Before we begin, I'd really appreciate it if you can hit that like button because that would help the channel out so much. Thank you. Let's get right into it. Now, it's not going to be any scientific comparisons of the two, but rather my experience with both cameras. And the first camera that I'm going to be talking about is the Panasonic S1 and why I chose this as my workhorse for wedding films. I think this camera was so well built. It kept videographers in mind for sure. Even though it's not video first, it's a hybrid photo video camera. But Panasonic did such a great job in incorporating a lot of video features that you would see in a pro cinema line camera. The first thing I would have to say is the internal stabilization. It is a beast. There are so many times where if my gimbal wasn't on hand, I would have to hand hold this camera. As an example, in the wedding industry, you might find yourself during the ceremony not having your gimbal on hand when they're doing the recession. And while the bride and groom are now walking down the aisle together, I have to take this off my tripod and then follow them with this in hand. But I found that this camera's stabilization is so smooth, where it's not gimbal-like, but it is good enough for me not to have a crappy looking footage. So Panasonic's in-body stabilization is a win for sure. Another feature that I really like about the Panasonic is that you're able to change the white balance while you're recording video. Now that, my friends, is a huge game changer, because for the longest times, a lot of hybrid mirrorless cameras or even DSLRs, you would have to stop the recording in order for you to change the white balance. And when you're in situations where, let's say, the lighting is changing drastically, say the ceremony, for example. If you're having an evening ceremony where it's during sunset, you're pretty much screwed. I found myself in a lot of cases where I just didn't change the light balance and it just looked like shit. But the times where that does happen is usually during evening ceremonies, and you'll see the sunlight going down and everyone turning more and more blue. And there's really not much you can do, because what are you gonna do? Miss the vows and change it for the white balance? No. But in this case, while you're recording, you're able to change it. And on top of that, while you're changing it, I don't know what it is about the Panasonic system. It's very smooth. The white balance, you don't see a drastic change in it. It's fairly smooth with the increments. So that's a huge plus for this camera. Another reason is that it's nice and big. It has weight to it. So when you're doing handheld shots, there's less of a jitter. And on top of that, you have the stabilization inside the camera as well. So you can get away with a lot of handheld shots. And the monitor behind the camera, the screen, is super big, so you'll know what you're focusing on. I also really love the EVF feature of this. When you're shooting in broad daylight, unfortunately, not all display screens on the back of the cameras are bright enough. So this EVF is super useful when it comes to lighting situations like that. And it's super clear. It's almost as good or even better, I would say, than the display monitor on the back. Of course, the main selling point of this camera was the internal 422 10-bit codec, which you can choose either H.264 or H.265, and the Vlog upgrade that you can get with this camera. The Vlog is absolutely amazing. The amount of highlight that you can bring back is just incredible. The details in the highlights are amazing on this camera. Another thing is that there's no record limit. There's no 29 minutes, 59 second record limit, which is a huge plus. I would have to say those are the pros of the S1 and why I love this camera so much. It's such a beast. With that being said, I will have to go into the cons of this camera as well. The biggest con. It's the elephant in the room. Everyone knows this. The autofocus is complete trash. But with that being said, Although everyone knows it's not the greatest autofocus system in the world, it does work if you're mindful of it. So what that means is it works with native lenses. It's not the best, it's nowhere near Sony or Canon as far as the autofocus system goes, but it is pretty good to the point where it is usable. I have been using this camera for about 10 plus weddings so far, and there hasn't been ever a time where I thought the autofocus was as bad as people made it sound to be. It's not great. It is crap compared to the competitors, but it still worked. It worked most of the times where I needed it to work. That being said, I think there are certain lenses where the autofocus is a lot better than others. For example, I would never ever use autofocus with an 85 or a 50mm lens. I think those lenses, any telephoto lenses, it's more prone to having a difficult time autofocusing. And I think that's with any camera company. Any telephoto lens will give you a harder time autofocusing. Even my EOS R and my R6 had such a hard time with telephoto lenses such as the 50 1.2 and 85 1.2. The 50mm isn't necessarily a telephoto lens, but you know where I'm going with this, tighter focal lengths. So the 24mm and the 35mm lens pretty much lived on this camera body for most of the gimbal works that I did. And it worked totally fine. I have no complaints about it. So that's all I have to say about the S1. Moving on to A7IV. Let's start with the cons. Two huge cons in my opinion. Actually, three huge cons in my opinion. Number one, elephant in the room, this dude overheats like crazy. So for the A7IV, even when you put the setting to high for the temperature power setting thing, it still heats up like crazy and I don't like it. But with that being said, if you open up the LCD display, it will reduce the heat and overheating issue. I haven't been able to shoot any weddings with this yet. I have been doing some personal overheating tests with this camera, and I have to say, in room temperature, it does go for a while. I would say that it lasts over 2 hours before I get like a overheating signal, but I do notice that it still does produce a lot of heat. It's not super hot, but it is quite warm. A lot warmer than what I'm comfortable with. I'm not sure what it's doing to the processor or the board or whatever it might be, the sensor, but I'm hoping that it's not damaging it, crossing my fingers. The second issue with the camera is actually not what you're thinking. It's not the crop factor that you get with 60p in 4K, but rather the rolling shutter. I think the crop factor in 60 frames is not a problem for me because if I'm shooting a wedding and I'm putting on like a 24mm or 35mm lens on, I'm getting the focal length that I want. I rarely shoot anything wide unless it's getting the whole like ballroom or details of the ballroom or whatever decoration that they have up. But for the most part, when I'm shooting portraits, it's usually a 50mm equivalent. So I don't mind that at all. But what I do mind, which is the second issue for this camera, is the rolling shutter. Now, I haven't been able to do any weddings so far with this, but I did have cameras that did have rolling shutter, such as the Blackmagic 6K, the Canon R6, the EOS R. And from using those cameras, I did find the rolling shutter to be quite annoying because when you do shoot in the city, you have a lot of cars zooming past you, and you do notice that jello effect. And while it's not a huge deal because I'm so used to it, I've been shooting with cameras with rolling shutter for the past 10 years now. It's still just annoying that a camera in 2022 still has rolling shutter issues. And while I do get that it has to do with the 7K oversampling, it's still, I don't know, annoying. And I know that the Sony A7S3 and the FX3 do not have those problems, and that's probably why they have it in the A7IV, so that it doesn't essentially cannibalize those two systems. So I get it and I respect that, but wish I didn't have it in here too. So The third issue with the A7IV is the battery life. And it's not only for the A7IV, but it's more so the Sony system in general. Ever since the A7III, Sony came out with this new battery system, the FZ100. It still doesn't last as long what you would see in a Canon body or even a Panasonic. With my Panasonic S1, the battery life was actually, it was so good to the point where one full charge lasted me anywhere from 3 to 4 hours. And while that might have been me using the camera conservatively, that's still a lot of time. And it means you don't have to purchase as much batteries and you don't have to carry as much. But again, these are heavy batteries too, so it makes sense. And there is that compromise where having a smaller body does mean that you do have to make sacrifices in certain areas. But moving on to the pros, the reason why I really was attracted to this was because of the form factor. The Sony A7IV is just so light that it makes you want to carry this camera. You don't really necessarily feel the camera until the end of the day. Whereas my Panasonic S1, you felt that from the get-go, and that was really heavy. Just imagine carrying a gimbal plus a heavy-ass camera for 10 to 12 hours a day. No thank you. This with the Ronin RSC2 is a match made in heaven. It's just super easy to use. Moving on, another thing that I really like about this camera is actually the customization of the camera. It's super easy to use, and I do come from using DSLRs, and I'm very used to not having customization buttons. Having custom mode dials and custom buttons is such a huge game changer because it just speeds up your workflow. I really like this new dial that they have here. It used to be the exposure compensation. They changed it so you can customize it. So now it's my white balance dial. With that being said, this camera also allows you to change your white balance on the fly. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for putting that in there. For the longest time, I had to use cameras where you had to stop the recording in order for you to change the white balance. And like I mentioned before, that is a huge no-no. You can be the fastest person in the world, but it only takes a couple of seconds for you to miss a really important part of a speech or a vow. Thank you, Sony, for implementing that into your Alpha 7 IV. Much appreciated. Moving on to another pro of the camera, I really like what Sony is doing with their color science nowadays. The reason why I didn't switch to a Sony system earlier in the game was because I hated their color science. It was absolute trash, but they did it. They finally did it. That was the only thing actually that really hindered me from ever moving to Sony. I actually never wanted to move to Sony ever again after using the Sony A7S II. That camera made you look like you had jaundice. Yeah, it really gave a really nasty skin tone, and you couldn't really do anything about it because the 8-bit codec was complete trash too. Now, they did argue that their dynamic range was super duper good compared to other camera systems, and that might be true, but who cares? If your color's crap, there's no point. But ever since the A7S III and the FX3, I'm starting to love Sony color science over even my S1. I think the new Sony color science is more accurate to real life than any camera system I've seen before. So that is a huge pro. And that's essentially why I'm switching over to a Sony system. Not only does it have great color science, but like I mentioned before, it's such a light form factor where your experience as a wedding filmmaker, I think, is just as important as, you know, the couple's day. Because if your attitude is just not wanting to pick up a camera and not wanting to do your job that you're being paid for, that's not an attitude to have during a wedding day. And if you can change your workflow to essentially destroy that mindset, I think it's well worth it. And this was the answer to that. It's not that I never wanted to film, it's just that you carry this for a while, you start to feel the pain in your back. You start to feel lazy. And that's one thing that you don't want to do. You don't want to feel lazy during a wedding day because there's a lot going on. As far as image quality goes, let's be real here. We're in 2022. Every camera is 4K now. Most cameras have 10-bit codecs. These two cameras have 10-bit 422. There's really not much of a difference. I'll put up a few clips here just to show you how not much of a difference there is. So if you take a look here, all of this was shot in 4K 10-bit 422. And here we have the Panasonic S1. And I don't have a direct comparison for the A7IV because I haven't shot any weddings with it yet. But I have shot weddings with the FX3. And from what I'm seeing with the reviews online, it seems as though the Sony A7S3, the FX3, and the A7IV have pretty much the same color science and the same codecs. So you're gonna see the same image quality coming out of it. The 10-bit 422 codec is giving you so much information where it gives you a lot of room to make adjustments with the colors. And it's a lot easier to match the two cameras when you have such a higher codec. So there's no real argument with image quality with cameras nowadays. These are codecs that you can work with ease. With that being said, I just want to thank everyone for tuning into my video. If you want to share your thoughts on the Sony A7IV or even the Panasonic S1, comment below, whether it's negative or positive. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If there's anything else that you want me to talk about in regards to either of these cameras, comment below as well. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.